What's up guys, it's DoubleZug. So Restoration Druid is one of those evergreen specs in WoW where no matter what the expansion is, it's rooted in the same basic play patterns of, spreading your hots around the raid and jumping around in tree form. That's no exception in Mists of Pandaria. However, you do get a lot of really nice quality of life changes from Cataclysm and Wrath versions of the spec, as well as some cool utility stuff, just overall fluidity added to the spec, as well as being incredibly powerful in PvP, one of the most overtuned, overpowered healer specs like ever in WoW in PvP, honestly. Really only mitigated by the fact that everyone's kind of OP in MoP PvP, and in PvE in both 10 and 25 man raid as well as challenge modes being totally serviceable and a great addition for the utility you bring. And while your peak HPS isn't super high compared to some of the other HPS juggernauts in the expansion, and you don't have the absorbs of something like a paladin or a disc priest, your healing profile is very flexible. You get a lot of really powerful free tank healing, and you're super mobile, so you definitely won't be embarrassed to take a resto druid to any form of raid content. And in challenge modes, every healer can just easily get gold time, so don't worry about that. However, you won't be pushing for the rank 1 times with a resto druid, but in more casual 5-man content, challenge modes, and heroics and stuff like that, you can actually have a lot of fun on Druid. You can do a lot of damage, you can even do cat weaving and, a little bit of retail flavor added to the spec. Again, plays quite similarly to previous and subsequent implementations of the spec, focusing on Wild Growth, Swift Mend, Life Bloom, and Rejuvenation as its core heals. It doesn't yet have the retail mastery where you have to be sweaty about stacking your hots up on targets to, exponentially get more and more value out of each hot. Each spell still feels very powerful individually, and we do of course get access to 2 very new important spells, one being Treant Form, which is totally cosmetic, but it does allow us to go back into the old tree form instead of the disgusting new broccoli one, as well as Symbiosis, which is one of the coolest utility spells ever added to WoW, which allows you to get a huge list of spells from other classes as well as donating a druid spell to the class you target. The spec has no real weaknesses in PvP, just being, again, incredibly powerful overall, and in PvE its only real weakness is its lack of a DR raid cooldown like Barrier or Devo Aura, and lacking that super high peak output of something like a Resto Shaman or a Holy Priest. Alright, so before we go over all our spells and stuff, I want to go quickly through some base changes to the class and spec. They're going to be pretty important going forward. So the first of all, with the new talent system, obviously Choice Rows, a lot of the stuff we used to get in our tree, Living Seed, pushback reduction, stuff like that, is now just baseline to the spec. Druid being kind of a complicated class, right? It has a lot of actual passives here. We have some cat and bear stuff as well as our healing stuff. So we get our fall damage reduction in cat form, not really important, but kind of cool. Killer Instinct, this is actually a really cool one. This gives us 100% of our intellect as agility in bear or cat form. So, we lean a little bit into the hybrid stuff in Mists of Pandaria with most hybrid specs. And Druid is no real exception. We have some stuff in talents we'll talk about later that lets us do a lot of cool hybrid stuff. This just means that when we go into cat form, we get a big boost to our agi, so we can do some damage in cat form, and we're also going to be, a lot tankier in bear form as well. Living Seed, this is another talent thing that we get for free now. Previously, we kind of had to sacrifice some stuff to get this with talent points. Now, again, just getting it for free is really nice. Big buff to our single target and tank healing. This is whenever we crit with a single target heal, we get a portion of that as a seed, which will bloom on the next hit like a palm charge. So it reduces the overhealing we do from critical strikes, and combined with the regrowth's really high crit chance, you can kind of guaranteed get a proc of this anytime you need it, which is cool for giving EHP to big single hits. Another nice change to this is it no longer overwrites, but rather will stack up on the target to a maximum of 50% of your HP. So you can see if I just spam regrowth on myself, this is going to keep stacking up to that 62k, which is, 50% of my HP. So we do have the ability to pre-shield effectively damage, which is kind of cool, although mana expensive, right, with regrowth. Next we have Malfurion's Gift. This is going to reduce the cooldown of our Tranquility. All the Druid specs still have access to Tranks, so you can still get off-healing Tranquilities, and especially again with these hybrid talents we'll talk about later, those Tranquilities can be really juiced up. But of course, healing Druids, we want our Trank to be a little bit more powerful, so it does have its cooldown reduced to 3 minutes. And this also does reduce the cooldown of our Bark Skin ability by 15 seconds, so that's actually enormous uptime on our Bark Skin for healing Druid. Again, another reason why we're so insane in PvP. We kind of have a crazy short cooldown shield wall, but also in PvE, very powerful. Our mastery is very similar to Cataclysm, just increasing our direct heals by a percentage. And then once we cast a direct heal, so you can see I cast a Nourish, I proc Harmony. This will increase all the periodic heals I cast while this is up by 18%, and it still does a snapshot rather than dynamically update. However, there is a change to this which is incredibly massive for our play pattern, which is that the duration of this has been increased from 10 seconds all the way to 20 seconds. So what this means is that managing your mastery really is no longer a thing. You kind of should just always have this up. Just only even pressing Swiftman on cooldown and no other direct heals means you'll have 100% uptime on this easily, because Swiftman's 15-second cooldown, this is 20-second duration, so big quality of life improvement there. If you hated juggling your harmony around, you no longer really have to do that in MoP. And that also means that mastery just becomes better as a stat because it's, you know, your guaranteed uptime. We get our mana pool increase. All healers have this that are hybrids. As a healer, you have 300k mana. It does not increase with intellect anymore. It's just a flat value. Naturalist, this is just the thing we get for specking healer that increases all of our healing done. Meaningfully, the changes to MoP Classic made this 5% stronger, which was like about a 4.25% buff or something overall. Nature's Focus, so we get free hit cap on Moonfire and Wrath. Starfire is no longer available to Restoration. Omen of Clarity, this is unchanged, it's just a 4% chance to proc from all your Life Bloom ticks, and you're still going to be wanting to use these with Regrowth. Primal Fury, this is another cat and bear talent. So we get 15 rage every time we deal a crit with auto attack damage or mangle, and we also gain combo points from crits in cat form. So this just makes, you know, our cat and bear rotation a little bit smoother if we do choose to cat or bear weave. Swift Rejuvenation, this is the GCD reduction on rejuv that we used to get from talents. We now just get this baseline. However, meaningfully, this can't take us below 1 second GCD. So basically, you just always have 1 second GCD on rejuv at any gear level, and haste isn't going to reduce your rejuv GCD below 1 second. The last big quality of life change for like the basic toolkit is the life bloom changes. So you can see if I start stacking up life bloom on myself, put it to 3 stacks, and then I swap it to this AFK rogue here, you can see he's going to instantly get 3 stacks. So this means that swapping your life bloom around to different targets, you can see if I swap it back and forth, instead of starting from the beginning at 1 stack of life bloom, it goes all the way to 3. So this is another insanely huge buff in PvP for target swapping in arenas and stuff like that, as well as PvE for tank swaps, or if a player gets a really large single target dot, you can always swap your life bloom around with only 1 single global. So that's one massive quality of life change to life bloom. The other massive quality of life change to life bloom is that its duration is increased all the way up to 15 seconds. And this, paired with our mastery duration increase, means that we're going to have to, again, just cast a lot less of those busy work nourishes, busy work regrowths to refresh mastery as well as our life bloom. So the spec overall feels a lot more fluid to play, and more of your globals are going to be more impactful. So those are the main spec changes for class-based stuff. Druid doesn't actually get a whole lot of like transformative changes in MoP. Really nothing compared to like the totem rework or, you know, like shards for Warlock, things that just completely change how the entire spec plays. What we do get is a lot of really nice quality of life changes for the class, as well as a huge number of additions of like new utility stuff and defensive and stuff like that in the baseline kit as well as the talent tree. One big thing to mention here is that a lot of our abilities that perform specific are now just a lot easier to use without a huge gigantic page of like infinity macros. So things like Fairy Fire, now just 1 button will work in every form and will always cast Fairy Fire. Things like Mangle now require cat or bear form and don't have like 2 versions for each form, which is really, really nice. And a lot of cooldowns will now just automatically shift you into the appropriate form if you aren't already in it. So things like Might of Ursoc, which is a new defensive that increases our maximum HP, will automatically shift us into bear form if we aren't already in bear form. Things like Prowl will automatically shift us into cat form before using stealth. And things like, you know, Stampeding Roar will automatically shift you into a form if you use them outside of form. So again, not huge game-changing, you know, world-shaking changes here, but just really nice quality of life stuff, especially if you aren't the type of player to want to have 50 macros in your page that all have, you know, their stance modifiers and everything like that. The Druid is now just a lot more approachable in that respect. And the fluidity of the gameplay matches a lot better the class fantasy of shifting through forms, you know, without all the headache and annoyance. Alright, so now that we've introed the class changes, I'm going to go through the healing toolkit and talk about the spells one by one. So first of all, let's start with the 3 heal structure. So this is held over from Cataclysm. We still have our Greater Heal and Healing Touch. We have our Flash Heal Regrowth, which is a short cast time powerful heal that's a little bit less mana efficient. You can see from the tooltip here, there's a lot of modifiers going on in here that we'll talk about just after we talk about Nourish, which is our heal effect, a long cast time, very cheap spell, which is supposed to be super mana efficient. And this does retain the ability of healing for 20% more if the target already has a hot on them. So again, we retain this 3 heal structure, but the way we use these spells is a little bit different than in Cataclysm. Basically, the way this works in MoP is that Regrowth got so many buffs. You can see it has the 60% increased chance for crit, just baseline, that we used to get from talents. It also has the previous Glyph effect just baked in now, which refreshes the hot that it generates if you ever go below 50% HP. And also just like the base healing and the mana cost of the spell is buffed in MoP to the point where it really outshines Nourish and Healing Touch. Healing Touch just has like no modifiers going for it at all, and the only thing it does have that's like secondary scaling is the Glyph of Healing Touch, which you have to use the Glyph slot for. And all this really does is just reduce your Nature Swiftness cooldown very slightly, like 5% or something per cast, so not a huge value there. And so the fact that Regrowth just has all these modifiers stacked up on top of it means that in terms of efficiency, it's actually very, very close in efficiency with Healing Touch, but just does almost double the healing per cast time. And even if you include like the refreshing of a Life Bloom there, it's just really not worth casting. Similar problems exist for Nourish, where again, because our mastery duration is now so long, the value of Nourish, where previously you used this to refresh your Life Bloom as well as generate mastery both very efficiently, now, you know, we usually have a clear casting to refresh our Life Bloom in time, and our mastery is always up just from Swiftmend. So Nourish not really being super mana efficient unless you refresh a Life Bloom with it, and being incredibly, incredibly low healing per cast time, by far our lowest spell, means that 2 of these 3 spells you're very, very rarely going to cast, and the vast majority of your single target casted healing is just going to come from Regrowth, which is a totally acceptable spell to cast even outside of clear casting now with your extra mana. It's still far less efficient, almost half as efficient as something like a rejuv, but it's not terrible compared to other spot heals. Alright, speaking of rejuvenation, let's talk about that next. This is very similar to how it works in every other expansion that it's in. It's a 12-second hot that's a relatively low mana cost. It's only like 4% more base mana than something like Nourish, but it just does insanely a lot more healing, so really strong HPM, HVCT. Again, it has that GCD reduction, which makes its HVCT even stronger. The only real change to Rejuvenation is that the initial healing that it does on cast is now just equal to the value of a tick. So you can see if I press it, I'm going to get healed for the value of every other tick. So previously there was a talent that made it heal for a percentage of the effect. Now it's just the same as at 1 tick. This spell is going to be our bread and butter. It's going to be what we're spamming, what we spend almost all of our filler mana on. You can see that it's incredibly, incredibly efficient, having an almost 20 HPM as our spammable filler, and also because of that GCD reduction, having a super high healing per cast time, only like 40% less than Wild Growth. So very, very powerful spell. There's also some interactions with the mushroom that we'll talk about later that make this even better. Alright, so next is Wild Growth. This is our second like super powerful hot. This is a pretty expensive spell. It's almost twice the mana cost of Rejuv. This has an 8-second cooldown base, but there's a glyph for this that we're basically always going to be taking because it's such a huge HPS increase. That increases its cooldown to 10 seconds and makes it affect 1 additional target, going from 5 targets to 6 targets. This will smart heal 6 targets within 30 yards of the person you cast it on. So it doesn't radiate from you, it radiates from where you cast it. So you can very safely send this on the raid if there's a handful of players that are damaged. The other thing that's nice about the cooldown increase from the glyph here is that this helps it line up better with Swiftmend, which we'll talk about later in the talent section. So you can see the baseline version of this spell is slightly more mana efficient. It's about 20% more mana efficient and 40% more healing per cast time than Rejuvenation. So definitely a powerful spell. However, because of the buffs to Rejuv, it's not like that much better in its baseline state that you always want to be pressing this, even if it's only going to hit like 1 or 2 players. You definitely want to be getting good value out of your Wild Growth. So if there's only like 2 or 3 players damaged, and there's not consistent rot damage going out on the raid, it can actually be more correct to either save your mana or press Rejuv instead of Wild Growth. But in situations where there's any amount of consistent raid damage going out, or there's more than, 2 or 3 players damaged, you basically want to be pressing this on cooldown. There's also some interactions with talents we'll talk about later that make this spell very, very important to always have high CPM on. Similar to Rejuv, this spell does gain extra ticks from Haste and MoP, but it doesn't tick instantly when you press it, so you do have to wait for that first tick. So that's Wild Growth. Basically, when in doubt, just press it on cooldown. Our last super powerful hot is Life Bloom. This is a very, very cheap spell. Only casts about 6% of base mana, so like less than half of the casting cost of a Rejuvenation. In Mists of Pandaria, this still does stack up to 3 times, so it's not the retail version where there's only 1 stack of this. And you can only have it on 1 player still, so again, in retail, you can sometimes have this on 2 based on your talents. In MoP, you can only stack this to 3 on 1 player unless you're in tree form, which we'll talk about during the cooldown section of the video. This will heal for a small amount per stack, and every single stack you add is just linearly increasing it. So 2 stacks heals for double the 1 stack, 3 stacks heals for triple the 1 stack. There's no like increased scaling there. And this will tick every second, again increased by haste and getting extra ticks from haste for 15 seconds. And then when you reach the end of the duration, it will bloom and deal a large single target heal, which is again just linearly scaling with the number of stacks. This spell is super, super efficient, and because it stacks up to 3 and that stacking up to 3 requires 3 globals and 3 casts, you generically speaking want to keep this refreshed at 3 stacks on the target that's taking the most consistent single target damage in the raid, or dungeon or, PvP encounter, which usually means the tank. So this becomes a little minigame for us, keeping this life bloom refreshed without letting it drop off unless we desperately need our globals to raid heal and we can get some value out of the bloom. So how do we keep this life bloom refreshed? Well, there's really two ways. The first is, of course, just to cast the life bloom spell on that target a second time. This is actually really not that bad. So if I cast any of my single target heals, you can see that its duration is going to be refreshed all the way up to that maximum of 15 seconds. This is a very efficient way if the healing that you do from that single target ability isn't going to overheal, or if you have a clear casting proc, you can spend that on a regrowth to do it for free. So you can see here, I get my clear casting proc, I regrowth, and it's going to refresh for 100% free. You definitely do want to be spending those clear casting procs exclusively on regrowth for healing. One last thing to mention in the tooltip here is that the life bloom swapping thing that I talked about earlier only works if there's more than 2 seconds left on the life bloom. So don't wait too long for target swapping, or you can sometimes munch your stacks. If we look at the math on life bloom, it's actually kind of complicated, right? Because there's so many modes of this spell. There's 1, 2, and 3 stacks. There's how much healing it does if you refresh it. There's how much healing it does if you let it bloom, all this stuff. But the baseline here is that the spell is just incredibly efficient in basically all of its modes. But generally speaking, the very most efficient thing you can do is get it to 3 stacks and then refresh it as late in the duration as possible. If we do let it bloom, it's incredibly mana efficient, but the problem with this is that we then have to waste 3 globals putting it back up. One last thing to mention here, of course, this life bloom does proc our clear casting, which will reduce the casting cost of our next heal. However, importantly, this reduction will also apply to damaging stuff, and not just damaging stuff that costs mana, but also energy. So we can use this proc to, cast things like Hurricane, which would otherwise be quite expensive. The energy cost reduction is also interesting for spells like Swipe, which would otherwise cost a large amount of energy. So if you're already cat weaving and you're just keeping your life bloom up on the tank in a dungeon or something, you can use those procs to do a little bit of nice AoE damage. However, most of the time in AoE, you're just going to be using your Hurricane anyways in dungeons, so not a huge difference there. Alright, so last but not least, for core healing toolkit, we have Swiftmend. This is a short cooldown ability. It has a 15-second CD. Slightly more expensive than Life Bloom, but still, very, very down there in terms of mana cost. In Mists of Pandaria, this still does require the target to have a rejuv or regrowth hot on them for it to function. So it does require those hots to be active, but it doesn't consume them, which is nice. On cast, this does a decent chunk of single target healing, as well as summoning efflorescence around the target. You'll notice that the Efflo effect is much larger than it was in Cataclysm. It's now like a 10-yard radius, I believe, and it will linger for 8 seconds. So summoning Efflo would make Swiftmend one of the most powerful buttons in our toolkit by far. However, we're basically always going to be taking another mandatory glyph. So we have one mandatory glyph in Glyph of Wildgrowth, one in Glyph of Efflorescence. What this does is increases the direct healing of our Swiftmend by 20%, but removes the efflorescence effect from the spell entirely. So this makes Swiftmend basically just a nice little spot heal, and the removal of that efflorescence effect from it means we don't have to push this exactly on cooldown. So with that 20% boost, Swiftmend is still significantly more efficient than something like a rejuv. So we still do want to be pressing this when it won't overheal, but again, very, very much lower on our priority list than it was in Cataclysm, outside of certain talent choices, which we'll talk about later. So if that's all this glyph did, we would obviously never take it because we want that Efflo effect. It's very, very powerful. So why do we take this glyph? Well, it interacts with the next spell we're going to talk about, which is a really cool addition to Restoration Druid, which interacts insanely with this glyph that make this glyph the most powerful glyph of all the healers by far. So what this mushroom does is we can put it down, and it's going to be similar to the balance mushrooms in Cataclysm, where you can summon one, it's going to drop on the floor, and then a few seconds later it will stealth. And then after a 3-second cooldown after we press it, we can detonate the mushroom. However, our restoration mushrooms aren't going to detonate to do damage, they're going to detonate to do healing. And also in Mists of Pandaria, you can only put down one mushroom at a time. So we don't have to be spending a whole bunch of globals just putting down our triple mushrooms. Originally in MoP, there was 3 of these, but they changed it over the course of the expansion to the end state, which we're going to get in Classic, where there's only 1. This mushroom has a lot of different effects, but the primary one we care about with respect to this glyph is that with this glyph, our efflorescence is going to be active around our mushroom 100% of the time. So you can see I put the mushroom down, it's going to have this little healing circle under it, and it just never goes away. The mushroom has no mana cost and also has a 5-minute duration. So for 0 mana, we get 5 minutes of efflorescence effect. You can move this mushroom wherever you want, and move your Efflo to wherever you want. There's also a glyph of sprouting mushroom, which allows us to target it like a ground effect, but this is a 5.4 glyph, so I'm not sure we're going to get access to this like on launch. However, even without the sprouting mushroom glyph, you can just target this under a friendly player, or you can just default cast it underneath your player character. So this is incredibly powerful, right? Efflo is going to be like about, 20% of our raw healing. So getting it 100% uptime on the raid, again, for free, is just insanely powerful. There is basically no situation on any fight for any reason where you would ever drop this glyph. So talking about Swiftmend in the context of not having it is just kind of pointless in my view. With this glyph, Swiftmend is just a nice little slight efficiency increase on single target healing, as well as interacting with Soul of the Forest, which we'll talk about later, which is another little quality of life increase to the basic playstyle. If you didn't care for having to always press your Swiftmend exactly on cooldown, and to, like, aim it in the raid so that the little circle dropped perfectly on other players in Cataclysm, you just no longer have to worry about that at all. You can just move your mushroom around. Alright, so that's Swiftmend. Now let's go deeper into Wild Mushroom. So again, kind of a complicated one, so bear with me here as I explain this point by point. So again, first, after 6 seconds, the mushroom will become invisible. This doesn't really matter for PvE, but it's kind of useful for PvP. The mushroom will grow larger as it accumulates healing power from 100% of overhealing done by your rejuvenation, up to a maximum of 200% of your health in bonus healing. So kind of a mouthful there, huge long sentence with lots of numbers. What does this mean? So anytime that your rejuve ticks on a player that's full HP, or even any partial tick of the rejuve goes into overhealing, that will be stored in the mushroom. So you can see here in this buff that the mushroom gets, this is going to tick up as my rejuve ticks. So you can see it's going from 70k, 88k. Every tick, it's storing the whole value of that rejuve, even crits, everything. So kind of nice that the mushroom has this buff that's easily trackable by like weak auras and stuff like that. I would recommend getting a weak aura or some way to track how much healing is stored in your shroom, because as the tooltip says here, this will cap out at 200% of our health. So I have 150k health here. The mushroom can get maximum like 300k bonus healing. Alright, so I just let my rejuve tick a couple times, and you can see here that it's capped out at 296k. So again, this is just twice my current HP. And this will scale with stamina, all your gear. You can even do things like press a rejuve and then go into bear form. And because your HP goes higher, your shroom will actually tick up higher. So as long as I'm in bear form, this will go up. If I leave bear form, you can see it's still there. However, if I cast a rejuve, it will reset down to the current HP. So you can do some kind of tricks here with bear form, as well as, of course, our new cooldown, Might of Ursoc. So if I rejuve and I Might of Ursoc in bear form, now my cap is going to be 245 times 2, so this will tick up even higher. And if I have a bunch of rejuves out before I Might of Ursoc into bear form, I can get this to charge up to very, very high values. So you can see here it's going all the way up to like 360k, whereas before I was in bear form, if I, leave bear form and reset it with another rejuve, as soon as that rejuve ticks, it will go back down to that 296k. So you can do some cheesing with this mushroom. However, if all this like HP stuff with bear form and Might of Ursoc seems annoying to you, this is basically not relevant for like 99.9% of circumstances. Alright, so that's the like charging up portion of the shroom. And as I mentioned before, the fact that this stores all of our rejuve overhealing means that rejuve is actually even better than it looks, because, having a 20 HPM is nice and all that, but because rejuve is like a hot you're going to be spamming on players, it's going to have a decent sizable chunk of overhealing, 20-30%, even maybe sometimes higher, depending on how you use it and depending on how much rot damage there is on the fight. So the fact that all of that overhealing now is stored in the mushroom that you can later disperse on the raid with Bloom is a massive buff to rejuve, and makes casting and like blanketing rejuve across the raid feel a lot less bad on fights where the rot damage is low and the burst damage is high. The other thing to mention here is you can see this shroom has 50k healing in it. So let's say the raid stack moves over here, I press it again. This will retain all of that stored healing. So you can move it around every 3 seconds and it will not cancel the healing out. The only downside to moving the mushroom is your efflorescence. So efflorescence will update with everything dynamically except haste. So you can see here, my Efflo is ticking for like 7k. If I put on an intellect flask and I go 1000 intellect up, now it's healing for 7157. If I take it off, it's going to dynamically update back down to 50. So this will update dynamically with everything except haste. Haste is snapshotted when you put the mushroom down. For example, if I have Bloodlust, which is, 30% multiplicative, if I have Troll Racial on top of that, which is another 20% multiplicative, if I have any kind of haste procs from, for example, like these haste trinkets in Cataclysm, any haste on uses, any haste procs from weapon enchants or anything like that, all of that will snapshot into the efflorescence when I put down my mushroom, and if I lose those buffs, I will still have that higher tick rate for the entire duration until, crucially, I move the mushroom or I bloom the mushroom. So this snapshotting is something I'll talk about a little bit later. However, of course, in trying to hold the snapshot, you both lose the ability to move your mushroom as well as bloom it, which is, two pretty big sacrifices to make. So the overall healing you gain from that snapshot has to be pretty high in order to make up for that loss. Also, because lust is such a huge part of the snapshot, and no raid is going to pre-lust before the pull so that the healer can do a tiny amount more healing, there really isn't going to be pre-pull sets for this, in my opinion. So I wouldn't worry too much about like having to sweat over pre-pull haste setups. Alright, so that's Mushroom and Efflo. Now let's talk about the Bloom. So the Bloom has a base healing. So you can see here at 85, it's like about 33k. So if I have no charge on my mushroom and I pop this, it's going to heal me for, 30k there. The mushroom effect, both the stored healing and the base healing cannot crit. So this is to prevent you from like double dipping on crits with your rejuv, because if you crit on a rejuv, it will store the crit value in your mushroom. And then if you could crit again with the mushroom detonate, you'd be double dipping. The same thing is true for mastery. However, the base healing of the Bloom does benefit from mastery, and also will proc your mastery. So if you see if I push this, I will get harmony. So it'll always benefit from mastery buff. You don't have to worry about putting that up before you detonate your shroom. Also, this is AoE capped at, I believe, 6 targets. After 6 targets, this will just start to split evenly, so you gain no extra healing beyond 6 targets as far as my testing shows, which does seem to be consistent with like patch notes and stuff like that for AoE effects in MoP. And the same thing is true for the bonus healing. So if I rejuve myself and start to charge up some healing on this mushroom, let's say I get up to, 20k here, cancel my rejuve, so I have 26k healing on here. So if I detonate it with just myself in the radius, it's going to heal me for the 30k base plus the 30k stored. If there's 2 players, we're each going to get 30k. If there's 3 players, we're each going to get, 60k divided by 3. So past the 6 target limit where you're not getting any extra healing from your base healing, there's actually no AoE scaling on this at all, which means it's not like super important that we have more than 6 players inside of our mushroom. Efflo caps at 3 targets and the burst caps at 6. So if you look at Mushroom Bloom here, like beyond 6 targets, our base healing caps off, and all of our stored healing, which is again 200% of our HP max, is just going to be distributed evenly. So again, beyond 6 targets, there's no real gain on our mushroom beyond just, maybe reduced overhealing from splitting that up evenly if the raid's like evenly being damaged. One last thing to mention about Bloom here is that we do lose some healing for blooming on the back end, right? We lose our Efflo ticks, which is going to be the 3-second duration of the cooldown. Because you can see if I put my mushroom down, there's a 3-second cooldown that's incurred. If I bloom, it puts that place mushroom back on the 3-second cooldown. And then once I place it down, I have to wait a whole tick rate for the next tick. So I'm going to lose like 1 + 3 seconds over tick rate ticks of Efflo, which is actually a significant amount. Plus, of course, as I mentioned before, blooming your mushroom gets rid of your haste snapshot. So if you do have like a lust plus zerking haste snapshot on your mushroom, you could be losing, 30-40% haste on that shroom. And as you can see here, like with this Efflo loss, we actually don't even want to press mushroom if it's based until like 4+ targets. And we have to have stored like a sizable amount of mushroom healing for it to be worth it anyways. And this is not including the snapshot. When it comes to the snapshot, I did some math to try to estimate like how much value you actually got if you did snapshot a Zerk and a Lust together. And if you bloom like on average every 30 seconds, so this is about a 2 CPM of bloom, you're going to get a sizable amount added just from the baseline healing, plus like all your overhealing from rejuve is going to be stored. And so this means that if you're only snapshotting Bloodlust, it's basically never worth it in my view. And if you're snapshotting both the Troll Racial and Berserk in your efflorescence, it's worth it until not popping your mushroom increases your rejuve overhealing by about 20 to 25%, which, I think generally speaking on most fights, like this isn't really going to be an option anyways, because you kind of have to move your mushroom. And also this removes your ability to use the utility of the burst healing from mushroom, which is really nice on some fights. So generically speaking, I probably would snapshot on pull, but I wouldn't worry too much about breaking your snapshot. Also being forced to use your Troll Racial in the first, few seconds of the fight means you can't use it on like your first trank. You can't get healing value out of it, although zerking on pull will give you some DPS value, especially with Heart of the Wild. And also the snapshotting is a little bit better with non-Soul of the Forest builds, which we'll talk about during the talent section. Just keep this in mind that like Soul of the Forest builds have a lot more mana to spend on rejuv, which makes, you know, reducing your rejuv overhealing with Bloom much more attractive. And most of the time we're going to be running Soul of the Forest build, so that's another knock against the snapshotting stuff. So that's Efflo snapshotting stuff. Again, can be quite useful just even with Lust and Zerk and no like pre-pull, no trinket stuff for fights where you're not moving and you don't really need your Bloom. However, for most fights, this is just like logistically not possible and not super relevant. But if you are going to snapshot here, just remember to, you know, get that during a Zerk and Lust and to, you know, try to put it in like the perfect spot where it's hitting, you know, maybe the melee in the tank or the raid stack or something like that where you won't have to move it. All right, so that's it. That's literally all of our healing spells. I think there's like only 8 spells here, and 2 of them you can kind of mostly ignore in Healing Touch and Nourish. So a pretty basic toolkit, but again, a lot of little tiny min-maxy things you can do here and there to eke out some percentages. All right, so those are our spells. Now let's go over our baseline cooldowns here before we go into the talent tree stuff and glyphs. One thing to mention here is that Incarnation, which is our Tree of Life, is no longer baseline, it's now a talent option, so we do lose that cooldown. However, it's sort of made up for by the mushroom existing, which is sort of a mini cooldown, right? We can do a huge amount of snap healing in one single global by just blooming our mushroom, and for the fact that Tranquility was buffed. But let's just go through these one by one. So first of all, we have Barkskin, again, 15-second CD reduction for Resto, means this is very high uptime. 20% DR, 12 seconds, really powerful. We also now have Iron Bark, so this is 40-yard range, 1-minute cooldown, no mana cost, and will reduce all damage taken by 20% for 12 seconds, so identical to a Barkskin. It's very, very, very powerful as an external, high uptime, low cooldown. If your raid doesn't call for this, just like use it on CD, it's incredible. Because Frenzy Regeneration is turned into like an active mitigation thing for Bear, we have Might of Ursoc now. This is a 3-minute, 30% max HP for 20 seconds. But it only is active in bear form. So you can see if I go into bear form, I get this buff, but if I leave bear form, it disappears. So very good for like one-shotty mechanics in any kind of content. You can, you know, Might of Ursoc to instantly bear form plus the HP. You're never going to get killed by a one-shot in bear form with 30% more HP. So very powerful but situational for PvE. The other thing to mention here is that we get Fearer baseline, so every time you shift into bear, you'll get a little bit of rage. And you can use this rage to frenzied regen yourself for just a tiny little heal as an extra defensive layer along with Might of Ursoc. Dispels in MoP now cure everything but have an 8-second cooldown, so this is like the retail system you'll be familiar with. Nature's Swiftness is now reduced to a 1-minute cooldown, so incredibly, incredibly low, and this just makes our nature spell instant cast, so we can use this for healing or CC with like Clone and Entangling Roots. So incredibly, incredibly OP in PvP. Short cooldown, duration increase, and also in PvE, really powerful to use with like your regrowth or your healing touch to do very powerful instant spot healing. We have our B-Res. B-Res now reses with 60% HP, so less important you have the glyph. Stampeding Roar, 2-minute CD AoE sprint, very, very powerful for raid. And last but not least, we have Tranquility. This is our big AoE raid heal. It's buffed in MoP to hit 12 players in 25 man and 5 in 10, so about half the raid. It's smart heals, and the main ticks do not gain like extra ticks from haste. You're always going to get 4 ticks out of the main heal. However, the hot that it puts on the targets it heals will gain extra ticks from haste. So you do have some haste scaling on your Tranquility. The spell is like super high HPM and healing per cast time. However, it's a little bit weaker than like its direct comparison, which is like healing him from Holy Priest, right? Which is similar, 3-minute, does the same type of healing, but just heals every player and pet in the raid rather than being target capped, plus the 10% healing amp. And this doesn't like DR the raid or anything, but still totally serviceable and totally capable of covering a damage mechanic, which is really what you want cooldowns to do in MoP. It just might do a little bit less overhealing than something like a Hymn or Healing Tide Totem. Alright, so those are all of our cooldowns baseline. Now I'm going to go over our talents where we have a lot of extra cooldowns and utility stuff that's also very powerful. So our rows are going to be themed here in MoP. There's usually going to be like movement speed row, CC row, defensiveness, and then some throughput rows as well. So you very rarely have to choose between throughput and utility here. So our first option here is Feline Swiftness. This is just a 15% movement speed increase. This does stack with cat form movement speed increase, so you can see here I have 144% in cat form with it. If I take it off, I go down to 125. And this does also function in every other form, so a nice option if you don't care to use it active. Displacer Beast is very powerful. It's basically just blink. For a Resto Druid, it has a 30-second CD, and it blinks you 20 yards forward, puts you in cat form, and also increases your MS by 50% for 4 seconds. So this is really powerful, but a longer cooldown than Wild Charge. Wild Charge is kind of a complicated one. It has a 15-second CD, so half of Displacer Beast, and has a different effect per form you're in. So in caster form, it's like basically intervene. In bear form, it's your bear charge. In cat form, it's your feral leap. Moonkin form, you jump backwards, and in travel form, you jump forwards. So the cat and bear forms of Wild Charge already existed in the game, so those are going to be super familiar to you, but the caster one's like the most relevant for healing, right? So what this does is it just has a 25-yard range and it lets you intervene to a friendly player on a 15-second CD. This is actually really powerful if you use it properly and can be better than Displacer Beast. Or generically, I would just say just take Displacer Beast. Our 30 row is going to be defensiveness stuff. So Cenarian Ward and Renewal are interesting for other specs and for like PvP and stuff like that, but for PvE, we're just always taking Ysera's Gift. This smart heals every 5 seconds for 5% of our maximum health. This does scale with Bear Form and Gift Versoc as well. Renewal is just Desperate Prayer. Last of all, we have Send Ward. This is something you'll be familiar with if you played like subsequent retail expansions. It's a like ward you put on the target that will proc on damage and cause a little bit of a hot. In MoP, this is only very slightly more efficient than Rejuv. You can see Rejuv's like 20 and Snare and Ward's only like 26. And so this is just like much weaker than Gift of Ysera numerically. You can see here, Ysera is like almost 2.5% increase in healing, whereas Send Ward's only like 0.9. So just a significant difference. And also with Ysera being totally passive, it just makes a lot more sense to take than Snare and Ward, even if they were equal. So that's our 30 row, just always take this basically as a druid. 45 row is all going to be crowd control, like PvP stuff. Fairy Swarm turns our Fairy Fire into a 50% snare. Mass Entanglement gives us a 30-second CD that just roots everything around the target in this last 20 seconds. This is really nice for like ad management, challenge modes, any fights where the ads are CCable. Last we have Typhoon, which is a 30-second CD as well, and just as a knockback. Also, these are all castable in all shapeshift forms now, which is kind of nice. This row is mostly preference, but for PvE, I'd either take Entanglement or Typhoon. Typhoon's nice for like stopping things, displacing mobs, and Mass Entanglement's obviously really nice for, rooting things. And on certain encounters, this mass root is very powerful, specifically on like Will of the Emperor and MSV. Our 60 row is our first like super important throughput row. It has 2 options that are very powerful and a third option that's like close but just not quite there, but can be fun if you do enjoy the playstyle. The first option here is Soul of the Forest. This has a different form for like every spec, but for Restoration what this does is whenever we Swift Mend, we get 100% haste for the next spell we cast. So you can see if I put a Rejuv up on myself and then Swift Mend, I gain this Soul of the Forest buff. This only lasts 6 seconds, so you have to use it pretty quickly. So to best take advantage of this 100% haste, we're going to be wanting to use it on a healing over time effect that gains extra ticks from that haste. So there's a couple of options here for spells we can use this on. First of all, you can see if I use it on a Rejuv, this Rejuv is going to tick like almost double the amount of times of a normal Rejuv, from like 6 to 10 or 11. And you can see this is a pretty massive increase in its HPM and healing per cast time. However, this is actually the worst use of Soul of the Forest. We're much more incentivized to use it on one of 2 spells, either Life Bloom or Wild Growth. So our first option, Wild Growth, is going to obviously consume this buff and just generate a Wild Growth that ticks, almost twice as much as a normal Wild Growth. Swiftmend into Wild Growth is the best HPM and healing per cast time we can use with Soul of the Forest. You can see it turns the HPM of this sequence into like almost 85, and the healing per cast time is also similarly very, very high, even close up there to like Tranquility and 10-man. So this Soul of the Forest buff turns our Wild Growth into like a mini AoE CD, which just does incredible throughput. The second thing we can do with Soul of the Forest is use it on Life Bloom actually, which is also pretty powerful, deceptively powerful. You can see I have my 3-stack Life Bloom here. It's ticking, every 0.8 seconds. If I proc a Soul of the Forest and then refresh my Life Bloom, you can see now it's going to be ticking, twice as fast. You're going to be getting like 30-35 ticks on your Life Bloom with Soul of the Forest, which is pretty incredible. And this also means you're getting almost double the amount of clear casting procs from that Life Bloom. And adding in the average value of the extra clear casting and all that stuff, it actually is relatively close in terms of overall healing. There's also one more interaction with Life Bloom and Soul of the Forest I want to mention here. So you can see if I rejuve myself, proc Soul of the Forest, and then cast a regrowth on myself, the regrowth cast is going to get haste boosted. The regrowth hot that it generates will also be haste boosted, and then also the Life Bloom that it refreshes will get that haste boost. So all those things spell batch together, and you get to, double/triple dip a little bit on that Soul of the Forest. However, the extra value from your regrowth hot and the regrowth cast time is pretty minimal there. But that's something to mention. This interaction did not work on beta, but it does appear to work in pre-patch, so I assume it's going to go live. This means that whenever you do want to use your Soul of the Forest on a Life Bloom refresh, you're incentivized to refresh it with a hasted regrowth rather than just pressing the Life Bloom. So if we do take this talent, we want to get maximum value out of every single cast of Swiftmend, and we want to basically be casting this on cooldown so we can get the most procs of this in the fight length. And this becomes problematic when we look at the Wild Growth cooldown, which is going to be our primary target for this, and see that it's 10 seconds and not like 15 seconds. So this causes some problems with our sequencing, and I attempted to like compare these sequences together. So there's a couple options we can do here, right? There's one, we can not delay Wild Growth at all for Swiftmend. We just cast Swiftmend every 15 seconds. If we cast Wild Growth on cooldown, it's going to line up with every other Swiftmend because 30 seconds is divisible by 10, and that means we have to alternate using our Soul of the Forest on Life Bloom and Wild Growth. So this is one cast sequence. The next cast sequence we can do is delay our Wild Growth. So we're going to cast our Swiftmend on cooldown, but every time Wild Growth comes off cooldown, we're going to wait 5 seconds for the next Swiftmend, and then, you know, of course, Wild Growth with that Swiftmend. We're going to wait 10 seconds, our Wild Growth is going to come off cooldown, and we're just going to wait around for 5 seconds. So you can see my Wild Growth comes off cooldown, I don't press it, I wait for Swiftmend, and then I Swiftmend Wild Growth. So that's our second sequence here. Our third sequence is delaying Swiftmend for Wild Growth. So this is like the opposite thing, right, where we're going to Wild Growth on cooldown, and then if Swiftmend comes off CD, we're going to wait until Wild Growth also comes off CD, and then we're going to Swiftmend Wild Growth. So this means we're going to get more casts of Wild Growth, but less casts of Swiftmend. So how do these compare? They're actually all like relatively close. The first and the third sequences are going to get more casts of Wild Growth, but less of them are going to be boosted. The last sequence is going to get less casts of Swiftmend, so less overall boosts by Soul of the Forest entirely. And the first one is going to get like maximum Wild Growths and also all the Swiftmends, but some of those Swiftmends are going to be used on Life Bloom. If we look at a full model of like each sequence, we can see over here that delaying Wild Growth or alternating between Wild Growth and Life Bloom with our boosting, they're both going to be pretty close, with alternating being like 0.6, 0.7% HPS ahead. And then with our last option of delaying Swiftmend being very significantly behind, between like 3 to 3.5 to 4% behind the other two options, which is intuitive, right? It makes intuitive sense that you want to get the maximum amount of boosts possible, especially if boosting Life Bloom and Wild Growth are going to be pretty similar in terms of overall value. So any system that causes you to delay your Swiftmend cast at all is going to be pretty bad. So what's the takeaway from all this like sequencing and math stuff? Basically, you always want to Swiftmend as close to on cooldown as you possibly can if you're taking Soul of the Forest. And then whatever you use that Soul of the Forest on doesn't really matter too much as long as it's either a Life Bloom or a Wild Growth. Either one doesn't really matter. If the tank's taking heavy damage, you can Life Bloom. If the raid's taking heavy damage, you can preference Wild Growth. If the raid is consistently taking heavy damage, delay Wild Growth for Swiftmend. If not, if there's mixed damage, if the tank is taking a lot of damage, alternate Wild Growth with Life Bloom. Also, something else to keep in mind is that the 6-second duration of Soul of the Forest means that you can hold this for 1 or 2 globals before you Wild Growth or Life Bloom after you press your Swiftmend at no cost. You have a little bit of wiggle room to wait for the raid to take damage, or for your Life Bloom to be closer to expiring, or for the tank to take some damage so that you can refresh with a Regrowth or a Nourish that won't overheal. Alright, so that's Soul of the Forest. Next we have Incarnation. This is our tree form for Resto Druid. All the other forms now get their version of tree form with Son of Ursoc, King of the Jungle, and Chosen of Elune. And this is a little bit of a bummer because it moves our tree form as, you know, our version of Incarn onto the talent tree, as opposed to just being baseline like it was in Cataclysm. Tree of Life is functionally identical to how it worked in Cataclysm. It lasts 30 seconds on a 3-minute CD, increases all healing done by 15% for the duration, and still does boost a lot of our core toolkit. So for example, in tree form, Regrowth is now instant cast. Wild Growth affects 2 additional targets, so up to 8 with the Glyph. Most importantly, it allows Life Bloom to be cast on unlimited targets. So similar to Soul of the Forest, there's a lot of different sequences you can do inside of your Incarn. You can spread 1 stack Life Bloom on the raid, you can spread 2 stack, 3 stack Life Bloom, you can spam Rejuv, you can use your Tranquility inside tree form, outside tree form. I attempted to try to compare them just in terms of like raw HPS. There's obviously situational things that are going to cause you to tend towards one or the other. Spamming rejuv is going to be your highest HPS, healing per cast time. Tranquility in tree form is going to give you 15% more on your tranquility, but it's going to reduce your mana efficiency if you do that healing with life bloom in tree form anyways. So there's a lot of things to balance here. Basically, if you really need the burst healing, you can stack trank in tree form. Otherwise, I think your best bet in terms of your overall healing is going to be to wild growth on cooldown. You want a wild growth on cooldown really no matter what sequence you choose to do, as wild growth on 8 targets is just incredibly high healing per cast time and HPM. So that kind of goes without saying. The question is what you do with your other filler globals in the tree form. And I think that the overall best option here is to spread double stack life blooms. Double stack and triple stack life blooms are about the same amount of healing overall. I think double stack life bloom getting more coverage, at a relatively low amount of haste, you can get like 9 targets with 2 life blooms, so it's almost full coverage in a 10-man. This is going to be super efficient, like rot healing plus the blooms giving you a little bit of burst on all those targets. And it's just going to save you an insane amount of mana versus spamming rejuv while doing similar healing. So your overall HPS is going to go up. So if you need like the rot healing, if you can time your tree form so that those blooms go off during burst damage, I definitely think the double or triple stack life bloom spread is going to be your best option for overall HPS. However, again, if you do need the burst healing, you can always trank in tree form, spam some rejuv in tree form. That is going to be a little bit higher healing per cast time, especially at lower levels of haste where that GC reduction on rejuv is going to be very helpful for doing a lot more healing. So it's a little bit complicated and sequence-based and contextual to estimate the total amount of healing you get from Incarn. The 15% healing on 30 seconds on a 3-minute is about 2.5% average healing increase overall, which is decently significant. And then of course all the benefit you gain from life bloom spreading, your wild growths being juiced inside of tree form, all that stuff is also going to be calculated. So I did my best to estimate this in the Sims, and it does come out relatively close to Soul of the Forest. So your Vigil Soul of the Forest is going to be like within 1 to 3% of Vigil plus Incarn. Of course, there's going to be variance here based on how you use your tree form, how the fight works. However, I do think these are close enough that you can kind of just take them based on preference. If you really like tree form, if you like playing around with the flexibility, the life bloom stacking, all the different options you have with tree form. If you need another 3-minute throughput cooldown for like maybe 10 men, you need to cover a new damage mechanic. By default, however, I would just take Soul of the Forest. Despite the fact that this relies so heavily on Swiftman CPM, making it a little bit more like, skill-based, I think Incarn's also pretty skill-based. I think getting maximum value out of tree form is actually a little bit harder than Soul of the Forest. Alright, so last and kind of unfortunately least, we have Force of Nature. This is something that you'll probably be familiar with if you played retail. They definitely brought this back in a big way, and I believe like Dragonflight was the first one to do this, and then in War Within they made like a whole hero talent tree around your little treant guys. So this is a button with 3 charges and a 20-second recharge. So this means that every 20 seconds you can get a little bit of a healing boost, or every minute you can get a big massive like triple treant. So the charge system here is really nice. It means you don't have to like push this exactly on cooldown to get full uptime. What it does is it will summon a treant for 15 seconds, so 20-second recharge, 15-second duration. You have pretty high uptime on this if you just push it on CD. And the treants will do different things based on what spec you're in. For Guardian, they'll like taunt. For Balance and Feral, they do some damage. For Resto, what they do is on summon, they will put an Efflo down, which does AoE healing. It's capped at 3, just like a normal Efflo, but it does a little bit less healing. They'll cast a single target heal instantly when you cast them, so you can see it got chunked there. And then for as long as they're active, they'll cast healing touches on injured players in the raid. So this is actually a pretty powerful effect. As I mentioned before, you can either send these on cooldown for some just rot healing, or you can stack them up for burst healing. One thing to mention here is that if I summon all 3, they're off GCD, so I can just spam it out. Summon 3 of these guys, and the Efflorescence AoE that they spawn does stack. You can see I'm getting hit by 3 ticks of that. Obviously the healing touches they cast do stack. So you can get a pretty nice minute burst window with the treants. The real problem with these is just the numerical balancing of them. They're just a little bit weaker than the other 2 options. My testing on beta showed that the Efflo did benefit from our mastery, but the direct healing they do doesn't benefit. I'm unsure what kind of buffs they can get, if they can get lust, how they scale with the player haste, all that stuff. They do appear to scale with player haste though. You can see if I'm naked and I press a treant, their cast time and healing touch is 2.5, whereas if I put my gear back on and I summon a new one, now its healing touch time is 2.1, 2.2, so it's identical to mine. on my player character. So they do scale. I assume they also inherit player crit. But again, you can see here like Vigil Soul of the Forest is just, you know, like 10, 11k higher than Vigil Force of Nature, so you're losing like 5 to 6% healing. However, this is not really as big as it seems, especially if you're the type of player that doesn't use Soul of the Forest very well, use Tree Form perfectly all the time. I do think for a lot of like average players, if you just want to relax and kind of chill out, you can take Force of Nature, the charge system, the short recharge time. You know, this is just very, very forgiving as a healing mechanic. And as long as you're like in the raid stack and you just kind of, whenever there's damage, summon these 1 or 2, and you don't overcap on charges, which is very easy not to do. It's really not hard with a little bit of misplay on Soul of the Forest and Incarn for this Force of Nature spell to actually start to like be good. So at the very highest levels, if you're like fully min-maxing your HPS, I would definitely take Soul of the Forest or Incarn. But if you're more like casual players, you don't really care too much, if you just really like the Treant gameplay, you aren't losing that much to take Force of Nature. Alright, so that's our 60 row. Last thing to mention here with Soul of the Forest really quickly is that the haste doesn't only apply to healing spells. So you can use this, for example, to do like a really hasted Hurricane, which will reduce the channel time, obviously, but increase the DPS of the ability. You can also use it on Moonfire to do like a juiced up hasted dot. Because it's coded as spells, you can't use this on something like a Rip or a Rake. It just won't be consumed. However, you can use this to do more damage in cat form if you put a juiced up Life Bloom on yourself. With Soul of the Forest, that's going to give you more clear casting procs, and more clear casting procs means more energy, which means more damage. So in this way, Soul of the Forest is our most flexible option because we can use it for damage, both single target and AoE, if necessary in like challenge modes, 5-mans, you know, if there's a damage amp on the boss or something like that. Whereas Incarn and Force of Nature don't have any damage component. Disorienting Roar, this is a 30-second AoE disorient. It will just CC anything within 10 yards for 3 seconds. You can see here if I pop it, going to disorient the elemental. This is really nice in PvE to like stop casts and stuff like that. And in PvP, really useful. You can, you know, Disorienting Roar into a Cyclone. Stuff like that, just like nice for CC chains. Our next option, Ursol's Vortex, is double the CD, but also really quite useful for like stopping mobs and also kiting and displacing mobs. So what this does is make a little AoE on the ground, which will snare mobs for 50%, and anytime they move out of it, it'll pull them back in the first time they move out. This is really useful in combination with Typhoon. You can see I can Typhoon the mob out, and it's going to pull it back in. So this is obviously really useful for like snaring and kiting. However, in like PvE content, it makes your Typhoon into a stop that won't knock the mobs into Africa, where, you know, everyone's going to get mad at you for knocking them out of AoE. If you put your Vortex down before you Typhoon, no one will ever yell at you, which is really nice. Druids do lose Bash as like a baseline stun in bear form, but now we get it back on the talent tree here with Mighty Bash. This is a 50-second CD, 5-second stun, usable in all forms. Again, just really nice for PvP. In PvE, it's not hugely useful. You'll definitely want to be taking one of these other two options in PvE. Our 90 row is our last super important throughput row. There's 3 options here, however, one of them is just like significantly inferior. Dream of Cenarius has a very interesting effect. It causes our Wrath to do 20% more damage, and also to Smart Heal a nearby ally for 100% of the damage done. So this gives us a little bit of like an Atonement / Eminence style effect. However, the damage and healing on Wrath is just like very weak. You can see its HPM is like about half of rejuv, so we just lose like a very significant amount of HPS, about like 10% of our healing, in order to gain like a pretty minimal amount of damage, really, honestly. It's about a 1-to-1 HPS to DPS ratio, but unless the boss has like a crazy high damage amp on it for a very long time, the HPS loss you take here is just like too significant to really be worth it in my view. Especially given that the other 2 options on the row also do provide some amount of damage, so you're not actually even gaining like the full DPS amount because of the opportunity cost of not taking Heart of the Wild or Vigil, which will also give you free DPS. Also the conditional strength of Dream of Cenarius on those fights where there is a damage amp. I think that Heart of the Wild is just going to perform better when there's that damage amp in terms of damage. So unless you both need like high healing and damage at the same time, and the boss has a big damage amp, Dream of Cenarius is just kind of useless in my view. Alright, so now that we've dumpstered your dreams of Atonement healing on Resto Druid, let's talk about Heart of the Wild first. This gives us a 6% increase to Stamina, Agility, and Intellect passively. So really we care about the Stamina a little bit, just for living stuff, as well as like Ysera's gift value. So stamina, not insignificant, but mostly we care about the intellect, right? So a 6% increase to intellect is about like a 3.7 to 4% increase to healing on average, but not anything totally insane. The cooldown effect here is really powerful. It's 6-minute cooldown, so a very long cooldown, but it lasts for 45 seconds, so very, very long duration. This cooldown is going to grant us a huge amount of benefits to all the specs that we aren't while it's up. So for that 45 seconds, we're going to be better at doing balance stuff, feral stuff, and guardian stuff. So for bear form, we get expertise and hit, which we don't get baseline. We're going to get armor and vengeance, and we're also going to be crit immune. So we can like emergency tank on this, but that's really not usually what we're going to be doing as a healer. Well, in cat, we're again going to get that hit chance and expertise, which we don't have baseline, which is a big problem on raid boss level mobs. We're also going to get more agility, so we're going to be able to do a lot more damage in cat form. For balance, we're going to get more spell damage, and we're also going to have all of our spells reduced by 100% mana cost. So those are the like alternate spec functions of Heart of the Wild. However, the buff also is going to give us 25% increased healing for the full duration of that 45 seconds, based on the uptime, about a 3.2% average increase to healing. So together with the intellect, if we use the cooldown fully for healing, we're going to get about like 6 to 7% more healing from Heart of the Wild. The problem with this though is that because this buffs our damage so much, we really want to be using this like on pull in Lust or during a damage amp phase of the boss to pump really heavy damage. When it comes to doing damage in Heart of the Wild, based on my testing, just like pure caster, keeping up your Moonfire and spamming Wrath will be slightly ahead of full cat DPS. However, I do think you can get a very small amount of value, like just a handful of percent, by putting your dots up in cat, spending all your energy, and then going back to caster and, you know, keeping your Moonfire up, spamming a couple Wraths, going back into cat once your energy has regened, spending all your energy again, and then going back to caster and alternating. If you do that sequence, you will gain like a very slight amount of damage. I haven't done like fully exhaustive testing on this, but I don't think it's more than 5%. So if you don't want to sweat, I would recommend just staying in caster form and just kind of brainlessly spamming Wrath. If you prefer cat weaving though, if you just find it more fun, you can always do that and not lose too much. We don't have that many abilities in cat. We really only have Rake, Mangle, and Bite, so it's not like a hugely complicated rotation. And the fact that this reduces the mana cost of our damaging spells means there's no healing cost to pressing them, which is quite nice. So again, something to keep in mind that if you do use this cooldown primarily for damage, half for damage, you know, some percentage for damage rather than healing, you're going to get significantly less than this average value of like 6 to 7% more. And on the sheet, I did sim everything assuming that you used the cooldown fully for healing. So this makes Heart of the Wild look a little bit better compared to like Vigil and Dream of Cenarius than it really is in terms of healing. For the most part, you are going to be using this either on pull or inside of like a burst phase where the boss is taking damage amp to do really high damage. However, you can do things like 30 seconds before a phase of burst healing, you can pop your Heart of the Wild, do a bunch of damage, and then with the last 15 seconds, boost your Trank and your Wild Growth and a couple of spells in there to get some mixed value there between damage and healing. Heart of the Wild's value, because it has such a long cooldown and a long uptime, means it's going to be really good on like very, very, very short fights, and then also gain some value on fights that are like just over 6 minutes, whereas something like Nature's Vigil has a much lower CD, so it's going to be more like smooth value over every fight length. So speaking of Nature's Vigil, let's talk about that next. This is a 1.5 minute cooldown and lasts 30 seconds, so very high uptime here, and short cooldowns, like 1/3 of the time this is going to be up. Its base effect is it increases all damage and healing you do by 12%. So just that effect, you know, 33% of 12 is 4. This is a 4% healing increase overall, so this actually beats the 6% intellect increase very slightly. So that 4% is really nice on its own. Also the fact that it's an on use that lasts 30 seconds means we can line it up with other things like procs, damage instances, other CDs like Incarn, Tranquility, which it lines up with. The most interesting part of this ability though is its second effect. It says, while active, all single target healing spells also damage a nearby enemy for 25% of the healing done, and all single target healing and damage spells also heal a nearby friendly target for 25% of the amount done. So this means that for all of our single target spells, we're going to be getting 12% baseline just from the base effect, right? And then also 25% more as a smart heal. So that means we're getting 1.4 multiplier on all of our single target spells. So things like Rejuv, Life Bloom, Regrowth, Healing Touch, Nourish. Most notably here, Rejuv and Life Bloom, right? Those are our most like efficient spells that are going to be scaling with this. And that means that instead of a 4% increase overall on average, we're getting like a 13.33% average increase to these spells. And because so much of our healing is coming from rejuv and life bloom, this is just like a very, very significant modifier. Plus, we're also getting this 25% of this 1.12 as damage from all these heals. And again, this is completely for free in contrast to Heart of the Wild, where in order to get the damage value out of this spell, you have to sacrifice a large amount of the healing benefit of the cooldown. The damage to healing aspect of Nature's Vigil is not very strong at all. This is mostly for DPS druids to do some hybrid off healing. For resto druids, if you push this button and you try to do like Wrath Moonfire or your cat damage, the healing it generates is just not going to be very significant at all. So for resto druid, I would generically just always use your Vigil as a healing cooldown to get passive damage rather than a damage cooldown to do passive healing. I have not done exhaustive testing on like full DPS Heart of the Wild versus Nature's Vigil, properly utilized on cooldown passive damage. My suspicion is that Heart of the Wild will be significantly ahead in terms of overall DPS if you spend all 45 seconds like on pull and lust doing damage. However, the healing loss there is going to be quite significant versus Nature's Vigil. For Raid, my recommendation for the vast majority of players is just to take Vigil, get used to using it pretty much on cooldown, and just allow your damage to be fully passive. And I don't think in the average case the damage difference between these two options is actually going to be that big, especially on longer fights, whereas the HPS difference is actually going to be quite sizable. Alright, so now that we've talked about talents, I can talk about glyphs. However, we already kind of talked about our two most important glyphs, and these are really, really hard locked. You kind of can't take these out. They're very powerful. You can see that Wild Growth is about a 6% HPS increase on a 6 minute, and Efflo is about like a 8 to 9%. And this is not including any kind of snapshotting stuff. So together, these are like a 15% healing increase. These are by far like the most powerful glyphs together of any of the healers. So these are hard locked. When we talk about our glyph slot, we're really talking about just our one empty major glyph slot, and of course our two minor glyph slots that aren't Glyph of the Treant, which is also a hard lock. Starting with Barkskin, this reduces the chance you'll be critically hit by 25% while Barkskin is active. So if you don't have Heart of the Wild, you could potentially use this to cheese by like using your Heart of Ursoc and then taunting the boss with Skin to like take a tank debuff. That could potentially be useful, but it's very corner case. Blooming is a really weird one. What this does is increases the bloom healing of Life Bloom when it expires by 50%, but its duration is reduced by 5 seconds to 10, right? And also our healing spells no longer refresh the duration, so you have to refresh the duration manually. Really not useful outside of anything but Sulong. Cyclone range is his PvP. Dash, 60-second reduction on dash. Not crazily useful because we have like Wild Charge or Displacer Beast now. Our mobility is so much better anyways. Phase Silence, this is a really interesting one. This means that whenever we go into bear form and a Fairy Fire a target, it will get silenced for 3 seconds. So this is really cool for like dungeons and PvP to like kick mobs into the group stack, or in PvP to set up CC or blanket silence the healer. Glyph of Healing Touch, this causes our healing touch to reduce NS CD by 3 seconds, so with the 1 minute this is like a 5% reduction, but it's still just not a great spell, so I wouldn't really take this. Glyph of Innervate is an interesting one. What this does is causes whenever we cast our Innervate on somebody else to have us benefit and them benefit, but only at 40% reduced effect. But first of all, we're selfish, so we don't care about other healers' mana, and second of all, the total gain you get from this is tiny, so I just wouldn't really consider this over other more useful glyphs. Master Shapeshifter makes all of our shapeshifting free, but it's already like close to free, right? It's like less mana cost than a Life Bloom to shift into bear or cat, so not hugely significant here. Might of Ursoc is actually a cool one. It increases the health gain for Might of Ursoc by 20%, but increases the cooldown by 2 minutes. So if you're using this for things like making your mushroom cap super, super high, or, you know, possibly taunting off a debuff off the main tank or something, Nature's Grasp, Pounce, and Prowl are all like PvP stuff. Rebirth is pretty useful for PvE. However, with Rebirth now returning players at 60% health, the buff to 100% is like really not that huge. But if you really care about your fellow raiders terribly, you can take this if you want to. Stampede and Stampeding Roar are both glyphs for our Roar, obviously. Stampede makes it castable outside of form, which is kind of nice. It saves us 1 global, but not hugely important. Stampeding Roar is the bigger one. This increases the radius by 30 yards. This is really, really useful if the raid is spread out, and is going to be very often swapped on for fights where it's good. These last two resto glyphs are going to be like the only healing relevant ones for this third slot, really. First is Rejuvenation. This is when you have Rejuv on 3 or more targets. The cast on your Nourish spell is reduced by 30%. This is really not that helpful because we're not going to be really casting Nourish much anyways, outside of maybe using it to refresh Life Bloom once or twice a fight. Regrowth is kind of an interesting one. This increases the critical strike chance of our regrowth by 40%, but removes the periodic component of the spell. So combined with the flat 60% crit regrowth already has baseline, this means it's 100% chance to crit no matter what our crit is. Obviously, the higher crit we have on our gear, the worse this glyph is. So if we only cast regrowth with our clear casting procs and never outside of that, it's only like 300 HPS increase, so like 0.15%. Not hugely impressive. So overall, what this means is that this glyph slot is like basically going to be super flexible. You're very likely to have rebirth in there by default. Maybe swap on like one of these defensive options or Stampeding Roar for fights with the rate of spread. And once we do get access to Glyph of the Sprouting Mushroom, this is also going to be hard locked. It's one of the only minor glyphs in all the healers that actually gives you some like utility value to your spec. If this is available, it's very powerful. Alright, so now that we've talked through all the spells, talents, and glyphs, we can finally talk about our rotation here. Luckily enough, this is going to be very simple for Resto Druid. We don't have that many like pieces in our toolkit. There's not that many moving parts. So first of all, for our maintenance stuff, we just always want to keep up our Mark of the Wild. However, this is brought by so many other classes and specs that you shouldn't really have to worry about this too much. First of all, we always want to make sure our mushroom is down as much as possible. This is a very high priority button. Efflo is going to be a huge amount of our healing, and because this is free and has such a long duration, you just want to make sure this is always under at least 3 players. Again, all the haste, snapshotting, caveat stuff also applies, but again, if you don't want to worry about that too much, you won't be losing really that much healing potential if you just don't care about your snapshotting and play your mushroom as intended. Not only does keeping your mushroom down benefit your Efflo uptime, it also makes, again, all the overhealing from your rejuvs have an opportunity to be reused again by it being stored in the mushroom. We want to be looking for an opportunity to bloom our mushroom previous to it reaching that rejuvenation cap. So it's relatively important to have some sort of weak aura or add-on or something that will track like the amount of healing your mushroom is stored versus your health. Our next highest priority is if we took Soul of the Forest to cast our Swiftmend on cooldown. Again, we want to be using this either with Wild Growth or Life Bloom. And if we do use it on Life Bloom, again, we want to be batching in either a Regrowth or a Nourish to get a little bit of extra cheese value. Again, if that does work on live, it could potentially not work. If we choose to take Incarn over Soul of the Forest, it's obviously going to have the same priority as our other raid cooldowns, which is very high. We want to be getting max uses out of these in the fight without stepping on our other healers' cooldowns. If you take Force of Nature, it's very high priority that you don't overcap on your charges. Although this is really easy with 3 charges, 20-second recharge time, you just don't want to be overcapping. Beyond that, you can of course pool these if you want to, but generically you can just kind of send them on cooldown for some rot healing. The next thing on the list is going to be to look for opportunities to bloom our shroom. The snap healing from this effect is very powerful, especially if you've charged up some rejuve healing. However, again, all the caveats with haste snapshotting apply. If you have a big juicy haste snapshot and your bloom is going to overheal massively, you might want to wait on it, even if you are capped on your healing charged up. Also, when you do bloom your mushroom, you should only really have like 1 GCD between that and replacing your mushroom. It's very important that you replace your mushroom exactly off that 3-second cooldown. Next, we want to always maintain our 3-stack Life Bloom on ideally the tank or the off tank that's taking the most damage. And as I mentioned before, it's okay to either refresh this with Nourish or Regrowth, or just to manually hardcast another Life Bloom to refresh its duration. Both are totally acceptable. After keeping our Life Bloom stacks up, we want to Wild Growth on cooldown if we're not using Soul of the Forest, or if we're using a strategy where we alternate. If we're using a strategy where we delay Wild Growth, we want to always cast it with Swiftmend. But for every other strategy, we want to cast Wild Growth effectively on cooldown. Unless, of course, there's like 0 AoE damage going out in the raid. Wild Growth is not worth it if it's only going to hit like 1 or 2 tanks. Our next priority is going to be to spend our clear casting procs. 99% of the time, you're going to be spending these on a Regrowth. Regrowth is a very powerful spell, however, spending these clear casting procs is not super high priority because the proc rate is quite low, so it's very unlikely that you're going to munch a proc. Even if you do have a Soul of the Forest Life Bloom out, which is giving you double clear casting procs, 4% is just not that high. So if you do get a proc, you can wait a few seconds, a few globals, etc. to find a good regrowth target before you spend it without worrying too much about, again, munching those procs and losing a bunch of healing. Our last priority here before filler is going to be Swiftmend if we don't have Soul of the Forest. So as we can see, Swiftmen without Soul of the Forest, just the baseline heal plus the Glyph amp is actually not super efficient. It's not that much better than like a rejuv, but it is still a little bit more efficient than a rejuv. And it is useful just for, you know, some spot healing, some emergency spot healing. You obviously already have to have a rejuv on the target, so usually you're going to be using this on like the tank or the off tank. So that's our whole priority list. Again, kind of simple. You just kind of want to use your talent abilities on cooldown, keep your mushroom out, keep your life blooms up, and wild growth on cooldown. When it comes to Heart of the Wild and Nature's Vigil, you want to err towards just pushing it on cooldown, and Heart of the Wild, again, you're either going to choose to use for healing or damage. If you use it for damage, you want to prioritize inside of Lust or inside of a damage amp. And if you're using it for healing, you really want to try to get that 25% amp on your Tranquility. When it comes to our emergency spot healing, NS+regrowth is our most powerful spot heal. 50% amplified regrowth with a 50% extra duration hot is going to be a very powerful spot healing effect. Next is just going to be baseline regrowth, which is actually decently efficient and like much better than healing touch in basically every way. Swiftmen's very situational, as I said before, but in those situations it's double the efficiency of regrowth and doesn't do that much less healing. We basically never want to be casting like Nourish as a spot heal. When it comes to filler, if we compare all of our spells that don't have cooldown, so things like, you know, rejuv, healing touch, regrowth, nourish, even, you know, Dream of Cenarius, Wrath, it's very clear that rejuvenation is just miles ahead. For our overall HPS, we want to be spending as much of our extra mana on rejuvenation as possible. So that's great, right? Super simple, very similar to basically every other version of Resto Druid. You just really want to be spamming rejuv on the whole raid. And again, blanketing rejuv and rejuving into players, even if it's going to be high overhealing, 50-60%, still has a lot of value because all that overhealing is going to be stored in our mushroom. Alright, so that's our priority list. Now I want to talk about stat weights really quickly here. So you can see this is based on like a loose phase 1 BIS setup. Intellect is like very, very strong here at 6.34. Haste is very weak between breakpoints. It still has some value because it will benefit our efflorescence between breakpoints. However, if we're going to be snapshotting, that means this has like basically zero value. Outside of snapshotting, if we're blooming our mushroom consistently, we will get a little bit of value from haste between breakpoints. Also with Soul of the Forest, we're going to have like little mini breakpoints for wild growth and life bloom with that extra 100% haste, which will matter somewhat. However, the breakpoints on wild growth and life bloom are just vastly less important in terms of overall healing than rejuv breakpoints, especially inside of Soul of the Forest. Generically speaking, I think you want to aim for the rejuv breakpoints. The first one's at like 30, 40, and the next rejuv breakpoint is not for like 10k more haste. And between these rejuv breakpoints, getting wild growth breakpoints, getting wild growth in Soul of the Forest, you know, life bloom breakpoints, those are really not super valuable, especially compared to our other like really valuable stats, namely Mastery and Spirit. And so my generic gearing strategy would be get to the first rejuv breakpoint, and then until you can get all the way to the second rejuv breakpoint, I would try to minimize haste and maximize Mastery. And because Mastery, we can now just assume 100% uptime very safely. This is just like a full multiplier for all of our healing. It affects like pretty much everything, and it's just very efficient point for point. This means that Mastery is just like a really incredible stat for Druid. Again, it's even very slightly better than Intellect in terms of like gemming 2-to-1 ratio here. Crit is decent, but it's just significantly worse than Mastery and even slightly worse than Spirit. Because Rejuv is our filler, is so powerful, this means that all the extra mana we get is going towards like a very powerful spell, and our filler like plus Bloom is going to be a very high percentage of our healing, a lot higher than a lot of other specs that don't really rely on their filler too much and rely a lot more on their short cooldown abilities. So when it comes to our stat weights, we want haste to our first Rejuv breakpoint. This is like by far our best stat. Once we hit that first Rejuv breakpoint, we then want int and mastery at about equal in that like 2-to-1 gem ratio. Then we want Spirit, and then we want Crit as like a close third there to Spirit. And then Haste is by far our worst stat between breakpoints. When it comes to racials, we have a really easy job on Druid because there's just not that many options. For Alliance, Worgen is going to be your BIS for like healing throughput with just the 1% crit. However, Night Elf is kind of interesting. If you ever do flex like Guardian, the dodge is actually really, really useful. Also, Shadow Meld's really cool in like challenge modes. PvP Shadow Meld's obviously incredible, but you do lose like a very significant amount of HPS for that 1% crit. For Horde, it's very easy. Orin's like pretty god-awful. It's just some health and War Stomp. Troll gives us Zerking, which is very, very strong with our Efflo snapshotting. We're generally going to get breakpoints on like Wild Growth and Rejuve potentially, and even like, you know, Tranquility Hot and stuff like that. while we're inside of this cooldown. So generically for Horde, you just always take Troll, and for Alliance, there actually is a little bit of a choice here. For gems, we want crit meta. It's about double the bonus of the mana meta. For our regular gem sockets, we want to gem haste until we hit the first rejuv breakpoint. So even if you have to gem pure haste, you just always want to hit that 30-43 breakpoint. For our red sockets, we want int mastery, or pure mastery. These are all going to be very, very close just based on like our gear levels. As we get more and more gear, I think mastery is going to pull ahead of intellect by a bigger margin. For blue sockets, we want int spirit or mastery spirit. For profession, NG is going to be bis because of nitro boots, and the like Priebus helm's obviously really nice, and the gloves are also really good. For our second profession, leatherworking is going to be nice for drums of speed. Herbalism potentially has some cheese with Efflo snapshotting, but I don't think that's really worth it. And blacksmithing, giving us 2 gem slots for either haste breakpoints or mastery gems, is going to be slightly better than like a regular intellect bonus. However, generically, I would just go NG plus X, whatever X is that you like or prefer. Alchemy is also interesting for the Alchemist Stone if you want that for Priebus. Given how good Mastery is for us, the Alch Stone is going to be a very strong Priebus option with the giant passive Mastery on it. When it comes to consumables, we still have like Conch Pot, Int Pot, and Mana Pot in Mists of Pandaria. I would generically use your Concentration Pot if there's downtime in the fight, but also Intellect Pot's like a pretty good option. It doesn't give us any regen, but the burst healing that we get from it is very significant. And for food and flask, we just want int flask and int food all the way. Some of the like private server guides out there tell you to get spirit food or spirit flask. Those are just objectively incorrect. So that's it. That's the Resto Druid guide. If you have any questions, you can always comment below or join the Discord channel in the description. If you learned something or you enjoyed the video, you can like and subscribe to help me out. I have guides for every other spec and MoP posted except Holy Priest, which should be coming pretty soon here, hopefully in the next couple of days. So thanks for watching. See ya.
Swobu, Zug Zug.